Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman, and this is a show where we have uncut conversations with experts in education, in security, and technology. And this week, we have one of the most unique experts in this field. Dr. Rodrigo Nieto Gomez is a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, which for people that are not familiar with that school, it's the most prestigious military university in the world, with students from more than 100 allied countries that attend. But he's also a mentor for startups. He's located near the Bay Area. He's a futurist, an expert in artificial intelligence. And his field of study is a lot different from other people in traditional national security studies, because he looks at the nexus of criminal activity and terrorist activity with innovation, and how there's an innovation curve, just like technology, where terrorists and criminals are always one step ahead of wherever our defenses are. And with that, he's just about to publish a new paper, which really aligns with the discussion we're going to have today. It's called Code vs. Concrete, the Future of Border Security in the Age of AI. So, Dr. Rodrigo Nieto Gomez, welcome to the Back to School Shooting podcast.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the very generous introduction. As you mentioned, part of my work has been studying and trying to understand that intersection between criminal behaviors or deviant behaviors and the innovation potential, right? So there is an intersection there. What can be done that the legitimate actors can do well, it also can be done by criminal or terrorist organizations. And trying to understand how that changes the dynamics has been part of what I've been doing for the last 20 years of my life.
And anybody listening to the show will immediately hear your accent. And Rodrigo teaches at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, but he's actually from Mexico, got his PhD in Paris, and then is now both an expert and an educator in United States national security policy. Rodrigo, can you tell us for a minute about how you came to be where you are now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's a testament of the United States, fantastic approach to talent management and leveraging immigration, that you can have a Mexican expert, a Mexican-born U.S. citizen teaching U.S. government employees about American government, right? So the truth is that the paradox is, as I was studying the United States policy postures on what we would call homeland security and border security, I did it as studying as the United States as an international entity. And that meant that still today I'm one of the few, you would call it, American government professors at what is mostly an international relations department here at the Naval Postgraduate School. My main area of focus is, as you mentioned, the first area is how criminals innovate and how they defeat. My area's expertise, or the first introduction that I had to innovation theory, was through the lens of drug cartels. So how do drug cartels are able to sustain this contested logistic environment when an adversary is trying to capture them or kill them, and nevertheless they have created these supply chains that are robust and resilient. So the flip of that conversation is then how governments respond to those actions. So what you would call the field of intrapreneurship, right? So how governments or big bureaucracies can run innovation efforts. And of course, right now, and this is kind of the subject of why you invited me to talk today, the main area of interest regarding intrapreneurship in government, but also in criminal activities, is artificial intelligence.
And with that, not only do you have a unique background in this, but you've been ahead of a number of issues. For full disclosure, I was in Rodrigo's class about 10 years ago, and one of our core novels or text for that class was actually about artificial intelligence.
Yep.
So everybody in this last year is saying ChatGPT is here, artificial general intelligence is coming, all of these. Rodrigo was thinking about this 10 years ago. And unlike other academics that were really caught flat-footed in the last year by what ChatGPT can do, how it's changing the classroom. Both Rodrigo and I have been using ChatGPT and generative AI for a while, incredibly powerful at things like data coding, data analysis, really formula-based, spreadsheet-based tasks for a while. And then everything got turned upside down about 3 weeks ago when ChatGPT 4 came out. And what were your first thoughts about 4.0?
Yeah, I think that for those who don't know, so 4.0, it's the latest model. The O means omni-model, right? So what they did is that they have integrated what used to be fragmented models, a model to understand video, a model to understand audio, a model to understand text, and they actually have now merged everything on a single model. And what I would say is that, to your point, so November 2022 was not a threshold on AI innovation because we've been working very hard. ChatGPT 3, which was the first one that came to market to everybody, is the number 3. That means that there was a GPT Model 1 and a GPT Model 2. But what it was a threshold on diffusion of innovation, right? Suddenly, a technology that was very niche and only being used by a few laboratories, etc. The New York Times had a large language model that they were using to apply their manual of stuff. Suddenly, it was available to everybody for free, and then for $20, you would get a bunch of premium features. So what this means is that it just force multiplied the capacity of this technology to alter society. And GPT 4.0, when it came out, did that again for what we would call omni-model. So things that used to be very difficult to do, like analyzing images, right? So there's many companies that have been trying to do image analysis, and it's really hard. Well, now for pennies, right, you are able to perform a fairly robust image recognition analysis that you couldn't do before. So we've been empowering people, and I think that this latest model and then the GPT-5 that it's announced for this summer are transforming the market yet again in less than a year and a half.
Yeah, and that innovation comes after there was kind of a relatively slow build in the school security space in a lot of things around using different AI models. Because there are now dozens of different vendors in the school security space that have image-based object classification, some different sensor classification, using acoustic sensors to try to detect gunshots. All technologies that have a single use case, a single set of training data that they're based on. And within these models, they can do one thing. If you have a visual gun detection company, and their model is just looking for guns, it doesn't see anything else in the images other than what it's been trained on, that one object. And it really blew my mind in these past 2 or 3 weeks of playing with GPT, how Omni is different and how the GPT model is different.
Yep. And it's important here to understand in which way this model is different to the other ways in which traditional machine learning has operated, which is the space that a lot of the companies that you describe are. And a way that I would tell your listeners to think about it is think how dumb is Siri or Alexa compared to ChatGPT, right? So Siri and Alexa are basically hardwired assistants where somebody working at Apple or Amazon had to think of every single permutation of how you would ask the question, what time is it? For them to hardwire that sentence so you would respond to it. So the only thing the model recognizes is the sentences that were pre-recorded or pre-established in the way the assistant operates. ChatGPT is different, right? You can, a friend of mine came with an example, right? He said, you can ask ChatGPT, imagine there is a sunken boat in the middle of the Atlantic and there's a clock inside of it that is running Pacific time. What time is it? And he'll be able to answer that question, even though it's absolutely not a way in which you would ask for the hour. And this is because it's a much more robust model that has been training. Basically, the totality of the internet has been its training space, and it has a lot of context that the other doesn't, right? So these transformative models, this generative AI, operates very different from pre-trained AI. And I mean, frankly, it's going to obliterate the market of anything that was pre-trained that doesn't rapidly adapt to generative AI. If I were, to your point, advising any of the companies that have been trying to build unique data sets, I would say you can dump all that to the trash and immediately start to see how, if you can pivot to add value to the raw answer that GPT would give you, because that's now your gold standard, right? You have to be better than that.
And it's not just school security. I mean, this is something that's really happened across industries. There are people that have built successful businesses for decades doing things like real-time transcription, doing translations. And all of a sudden, ChatGPT comes out, and a lot of those services are completely irrelevant because there's now a model that knows how to do those things. So something that's been low-hanging fruit for a lot of people across the school security industry has been trying to take existing security cameras and turn them into a mechanism to automate, to detect that there's somebody with a weapon on that camera. And we know that humans can't monitor all these cameras in real time. So you have an AI system that's able to recognize a threat. As soon as it gets that, it can immediately send a notification, and you take what would either be unnoticed or take a while to notice. And now you can send those alerts instantaneously. The problem has been that the standalone object classification creates an enormous number of false positives, because if you're looking for one set of objects in your training data, there are all of these permutations of similar objects that exist in the real world. And and I wanted to talk more about that with you, Rodrigo. What's kind of this challenge that's inherent to these raw classification models?
Yeah, so for any of for folks who might be in the LA area or San Francisco or Phoenix, for example, they'll see Waymo vehicles driving outside. So these are driverless vehicles that perform, and we have now actuarial data from insurance companies that perform up to 80% safer than human drivers, than Uber drivers that would be doing it, right? And one of the revolutions that these companies achieved, or Tesla in their latest release of full self-driving, is that they went from pre-trained models in which, again, their engineers would code every single potential permutation and this is visioning, right? So it's very relevant to your example. They would hardwire every single instance of what they thought would be a condition that these vehicles would look outside, and they would try to anticipate it. And it turns out that there are so many variables that you just can't do that. And they went to the next version, which is unsupervised learning, right? And I'll horribly simplify it. So if there's any computer scientist listening to us, I'll ask for their forgiveness right now. But what basically this means is that you take a few million hours of footage of what you consider good driving, right? You have coded as good driving, and you give it to the transformer model, and you say, hey, look at it, and you come up with your own rules. You don't give it to them. Right, so the model itself starts to look for the ways in which these videos, the trends and tendencies, statistical tendencies, and starts to classify it. Right, these are classifiers. Right, starts to make the classification. Well, the challenge that you described is very similar. Right, you can try to hardwire any single angle and shape and form of a gun, so a smart imaging technology would be able to identify it. And that is very cumbersome and it's very difficult. And there's 100,000 different ways in which this becomes complicated. The shadows in the picture and the umbrella that looks like a gun, etc. Or you can say to a GPT model, here are millions of images, learn to interpret them on your own. And these are not just images of guns. There are also swans, and there's chocolate, and there is babies. And of course, that would be very difficult to do for a single purpose feature like I'll be doing just to detect guns. But OpenAI, the creators of ChatGPT, are building a general purpose model. So it does everything. That's their goal. They're aiming for artificial general intelligence, right? So this model, when you show it a picture, and I believe you just run that experiment, Dave, and you might want to tell something to your listeners about it. But when you show them training images that are used for identification of guns, it actually takes consideration of a lot of other contextual cues on that image and performs incredibly well.
Yep. So it's down below in the show notes. I just published an article, which is testing GPT-4o with 16 different images that I think are representative of the types of challenges that you'd face with image classification of firearms. And so there are some pictures from CCTV footage of actual crimes in progress. Most of them are robberies, and the guns are in different positions, somewhat obscured, against dark clothing, on low resolution. And in each one of these, even though GPT can't see the gun itself perfectly, it looks at the context of the surrounding scene and then assesses that this is what I think is going on. I wanted to take that a step farther and get a number of gun-shaped objects, things that if you train something specifically on the dimensions of different firearms, these are objects that have similar dimensions. Things like umbrellas that are held in a gun position, sticks that look like guns, sticks that are held in the gun position. And in each one of these, even though you have something that has those dimensions of a gun, again, GPT knows all of the other context. Is the child smiling? Does it look like it's on a soccer field where there are other kids playing, where there's a dog laying on the grass? It takes all of these other pieces of information from the 13 trillion pieces of data that this newest model has been trained on to add that context. And then what blew me away is I found some pictures of air rifle teams inside schools. So your setting is a school, one's in the gym with bleachers, another is clearly in a classroom, and there are kids holding guns and even kids pointing guns at the picture. And the context from ChatGPT says these are not a threat because the kids are all wearing the same uniform, because there's a trophy that's also in the picture, because they're smiling, because there are kids in 3 different shooting positions. So that looks like a team posing for a photo. That is why GPT is a complete game changer in this field.
You mentioned before my wife's an interpreter, and I did some interpretation work in the past myself. And one of the biggest challenges that historically software had at trying to translate and interpret was always context, right? Language is ambiguous. And for many years, when computer power was not sufficient, where the transformer architecture was not well developed, the approach to that was to try to look for fixed turns of phrases and try to translate that one. And while that worked well 60% of the time, it would fail 40% of the time, and therefore you would have these awkward, weird translations that then you would have to have a human go and clean. What changes now with GPT in translation and interpretation that is based to this, because ultimately it's an interpretation challenge, right? You're interpreting you're seeing an image and you need to extract value out of it, right? So a different meaning is that this thing is enormously able to correlate contextually with millions of others, well beyond just what the task is being asked, right? So it's not looking just at the word that is being translated. It looks at the whole text, paragraph, and even the totality of the document. Well, the same thing is happening here. When you showcase a picture, like you said, of somebody with a laser tag on, or it will immediately identify things like colors, right? This looks like a toy gun because it has a different tonality. The context is clearly different because the kid is wearing a laser tag sensor, right? So things that a pre-trained a fixed model would not be able to recognize. So this is
exactly.
one of these.
An image that I checked was some kids having a water fight with water guns.
There you go.
And the water guns would absolutely be classified as guns by a system that's trained to look for the dimensions of guns. That system doesn't know what water is, doesn't know what grass is, doesn't know what playing is, what kids are. It only knows dimensions of this object. And in that picture, GPT says this is kids having a water fight, and it looks like they're having fun, which actually, when you think about it, it's understanding context, culture, scene, facial expressions. I don't think that we really understood exactly how much this can do.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is something that a lot of people have talked, how even the engineers of OpenAI were surprised of how good the model got, how fast, right? So this will be a conversation of how these systems have been trained and the technology behind pre-trained transformers, right? What builds with GPT. But I would say that for the purposes of our conversation, it has achieved something that we thought we were 20 years or 30 years away from achieving, which is a basic cultural interpretation of images that it's complex and it's rich and it's completely machine based, right? So we have three elements. We've talked about this, you and I, Dave, before. There are three elements that are important for any school shooting response capability. One is, of course, detection, and this has to do with the hardware and the sensors and all the things that. Then the other one is analysis, is the processing of what I'm seeing, and then the final is, of course, response, whatever kind of rapid response you want to do to the crisis or incident. We used to think that one of the hardest things to do here was the analysis. That it turns out to be that I don't want to say it's solved, but it's 90% solved. That GPT-like models, and specifically OpenAI, the quality of what they can achieve, and Sora, their video model is about to come. So it's not only still pictures; they'll be able to understand moving contextual video. It's made it. It has commoditized the analysis part of it. So any value will have to come building on top of that, because now this thing has basically solved the problem of showing an image to a computer and asking that computer to make sense of that image.
Well, here's the next big piece. It's not just the images. So after I wrote the first article playing with the different pictures of guns, over the last couple months, there's an academic paper that had been in draft forever. It's based on Daniel Kahneman's theory of noise. Kahneman's the Nobel Award-winning behavioral economist, and he studied how experts with exactly the same amount of information and the comparable training can look at the same information and make wildly different assessments. And in his book, he talked a lot about the insurance industry, that you have two different underwriters. They should be the same. They should be, they're looking at the same information, and they have up to 50% variability in how they would price a policy. And that adds up to billions of dollars in losses for a company. So I took that noise theory and wanted to study school shooting threats. And so I had a survey that had 6 different sample school shooting scenarios, threat scenarios that were all based on a study of real threats. And from that sample of 240 responses by police officers that are all involved in assessing threats, overwhelmingly, there was a high level of Daniel Kahneman's noise. There were scenarios where the responses ranged from 1 to 10, with 1 being no threat at all and 10 being the most severe. Just a huge range of variability. But what's interesting is the way that Kahneman said you deal with noise is that you get a whole bunch of responses and you take their aggregate. You take that average value. And so for each one of the 6 cases, found the average of those 240 responses, and it was somewhere in the middle. And it followed a standard distribution curve, and most of the responses were somewhere near the middle with a couple outliers. Well, if you're a school, you don't want to have the school resource officer who's the outlier on either end, because they might see a serious situation as no threat, or they might see a hoax and say it's high threat, we got to shut the whole place down. So what I did is took these 6 threat scenarios, the exact language that was given to the police officers, and I dropped that into GPT 4.0. The results are absolutely incredible. ChatGPT, with no training, no prompts, it wasn't fed the whole paper or a manual on threat assessment. In 5 of the 6 scenarios, ChatGPT was within 1 point of that aggregate group of experts. There was one scenario where it was higher, and in its description, it explained exactly why it thought it was a serious threat. Where do we go from here, Rodrigo?
Well, so you just mentioned a lot of really important things, right? So a lot of the challenge we've had with noise is precisely, or the biggest challenge is that you would want replicability, that you would like that for same conditions to obtain the same result, and humans do not operate like that. Danny Kahneman, he used to talk even at sentencing is one of those examples that they give, that you can even take the same individual and at different moments of the day, the sentencing that would be given to the same kind of cases would be different, right? So if I remember the reasons, if it's a sunny day, people give they feel more lenient, right? And things like that. So what GPT gives you is that predictability on outcomes, right? So you just mentioned it, right? The way these pre-transformers are given are created is that they have been fed the totality of basically the human knowledge that it's available online. And then these things, what they do, and the way I explain it to folks that have never played with them, is that GPTs will think out loud, right? So when you're in the supermarket, you're saying, I'm going to prepare a salad, so I need to go and buy tomatoes. And then what you're doing is that you're trying to put an order to your thoughts, and you do that by verbalizing things so you can give them a lineup and an outline, right? So GPTs do that, right? So GPTs don't have a logic engine the way Excel does, for example. There's not a mathematical engine behind it. What they do is that they produce the most statistically probable next word and next sentence and next paragraph. And by doing that, they're putting order to basically the totality of human knowledge that has been fed into them within the context of the question that you have asked them. So they will normalize a lot of the noise that you are describing, because they are by definition an aggregator. They're adding knowledge together. This actually has some issues regarding creativity, right? But even that, they can be very creative, because it turns out a lot of creativity is aggregating multiple fields together, right?
So, right, and that's in this test. What shocked me, I didn't give GPT anything other than the prompt. Assess the severity of this school shooting threat and give it a 1 through 10 score, with 10 being the highest. It came up with its own method for how it was going to assess the threats.
Yep.
And it did this based on having just broad knowledge about lots of things, because to explain the way that it was making the decisions, it created its own assessment score. So it looked for the credibility of the threat, how specific it was, what other background information was involved, the context and the relationship, and then the timing. And it gave each one of those a 1 through 10 score. It chose the score for all 10 of those categories, and it decided to just add them up and give an average. Now, what you could do is you could tweak this over time and say, maybe a specific threat should have 3 times the weight
Correct.
Of the background information. You could start playing with this, but even without playing with it at all, GPT was incredibly close to these group aggregates from actual human experts. And this is a place where, from our study of threat assessments, humans are not doing a good job at threat assessment.
Correct.
And that's playing out in real life when, before Parkland, you have a formal threat assessment. You don't take action. The day of the shooting in Oxford, you have a formal threat assessment. You don't take correct actions. In the real world, people are dying because of poor choices humans are making. Our study shows that in aggregate, 240 people made great choices. By themselves, they made really bad choices. ChatGPT did it as well as the aggregate experts in about 5 seconds.
Correct. And as you said, without any prior training, right? You are taking the raw model before what is called vectorization, which is when you start feeding it data that it's proprietary and would take it to the next level. So there are 2 things that are very relevant with what you discussed. One is, as you said, right? So even without any kind of prior training, it probably already outperforms 90% of products out there, or 99% products out there. And in part, this is because if you think about it, gun detection is a very niche challenge, right? So if you're trying just to do that, and you're trying to build a model just to do that, you're actually limiting yourself enormously, both in terms of resources, right? How much money can you raise in order to build that technology? But secondly, and more importantly, your data set, right? Your contextual data set. And then most of these companies are not none of them, to my knowledge, are doing generative pre-trained transformers. They're doing traditional object identification, right? So already there. But secondly, and I think this is as important as the first part, is that when it fails, and it will fail sometimes, maybe if you give it enough numbers of cases, although I didn't see any single failure when I was playing with it, and even when it fails, it'll fail in a predictive way that you can then go and back engineer and change, whereas humans might not, right? So the kind of failures that you will see, the more you gather data, right? So the better you'll get at it. And fourth or third, or I don't know what number I am at this point, is that this thing learn as a fleet, right? So if one school anywhere in the country makes that mistake, no other school ever will do it. The way I'd like to describe it, it takes one Tesla to hit a pothole for the totality of the Tesla fleet to know that there is a pothole over there, right? So as we scale this technology, in case it would be, for example, used for image analysis in the cases that you are describing, the more we do it, the more it learns, the more it gets better, right? There is an exponential curve of improvement when you are dealing with technologies like this one that are not present in the way humans behave. So that is the other very important part regarding the use of noise, that even when the system performs at a low level of quality, or some noise is inserted for whatever reason, once you understand that one, it can be debugged and corrected. And even in its raw mode, it's probably outperforming humans already.
And that's, anybody that doesn't play with these models doesn't really understand what's going on in these models. There's just a lot of discussion in the public right now about hallucinations or it being unreliable. I took 16 different images and prompted the same prompt one time. 16 for 16 were accurately categorized. I took these 6 different threat assessments, put them in, or threat scenarios, put them in with the same prompt, and 6 out of 6 times, it gave a score that was close to the aggregate values from real human experts. That's incredible, because a lot of the problems with GPT come from when it's working in a really unstructured environment. If you say, how do I create, paint for the roof of my house? It's a weird thing. It might say, mix olive oil and bleach, and, that's what you're going to get. And that's where those are the stories that people hear and they're like, oh, this makes no sense. When you think about how to prompt something and give it a clear thing to do with that prompt, these things perform extraordinarily well, and extraordinarily well within a field that humans do not perform well in, because we have documented empirical evidence with the narrative responses from all 240 of those officers explaining why they made the choices they made. And they made them for completely irrational and incorrect reasons. GPT will not do that. And if it does, it'll explain to you why it did that.
Correct. Yeah. So you mentioned the issue of hallucination, that immediately some of the things that people will be complaining. Well, first of all, as you described, humans hallucinate too, right? So they make mistakes based on a poorly understood original data. And in this case, your benchmark should be your average performance by humans the way you did. But more importantly, and again, this is something that is much easier to do with a GPT model than it is with a human being. It's easy to cut hallucinations, and we've done it to cut 80 to 85% with good, what you call prompt engineering, right? A lot of the problems that we see in hallucinations is just people being unskilled or untrained. I mean, this is a very new technology, so you are barely learning how to use it effectively, right? But very frequently, the product of an hallucination is actually the result of a poorly stated prompt that guided the model in the wrong direction. Just by adding what we call a train of thought prompt engineering, right? It's one of the most common techniques when you force the model to give you or to deconstruct the steps that it will follow to answer something instead of just coming out with it. We were able to cut for the same prompt, for the same task, up to 80% of the hallucinations. So a lot of the problems that are inherent to the novelty of the technology will go away as we deploy better. Will it get to zero? This is a very big philosophical debate among folks doing machine learning, if the hallucination problem is solvable or if you can completely. And the reality is that many of the so-called hallucinations are mostly answers in which there is more than one answer. These are not mathematical questions with a 1 or 0 response. But I think that there is already in 4.0 a model that for the kind of case use that interests your listeners will already have a much lower level of what you would call hallucination that their human counterparts performing the same task.
Yeah, because even if this is not perfect, it's substantially better than where we are now. I mean, I documented 1,000 different swatting hoaxes at schools last year. Every time that dozens of police officers are dispatched based on a hoax 911 call and they lock down a school for hours and find out that it's a hoax, there's somebody that made the wrong assessment of that initial piece of information. Every single time that there's a thread on social media that causes a school to lock down and ultimately it's found to be unfounded, that is an error that a human made in its interpretation. GPT can do better than a lot of the people that will assess this, because from the narrative responses and from the scores, one of the prompts is that a very detailed manifesto is posted online that says an attack is going to take place at this school, this time, with these weapons. And that is a very high threat scenario. From the narrative comments, there were some police officers who are working in schools right now who assessed that as a low threat because they said their justification was school shootings are surprise attacks and they don't publish any information that would give away their attack in advance. That's absolutely not true. That's a human hallucination. That's either a human
Correct.
who has slept through every single training that they've been to, or is just woefully ignorant. ChatGPT would not make that mistake. And based on these tests, it didn't. So this is, I think, a piece that you've talked about a lot, Rodrigo, with self-driving cars, with technologies like this, that we don't need to have a zero error rate. We just need to show that something is significantly better than what humans are doing right now.
Correct. And you just mentioned there might be cases in which I would be a little more lenient in some of the SWAT responses in saying, even though you are 99% sure that it's not it's a hoax, that 1% of questioning makes you still need to deploy. But then you would deploy differently, right? So in that case, your response would adapt to your level of certainty that you have of this being a real event. I think that one thing that has changed that we have not yet adapted to it is that something that we used to say that was impossible is now possible. We used to say, well, sure, you can have all those cameras, but who's going to be watching them, right? Now there's somebody, right? That rhetorical question is gone. You can have now a system with CCTV cameras, with whatever system, and you can have a fairly robust AI, a general AI that you don't have to pay a fortune analyzing them in different ways. Now, this technology will come, and it's already coming. They were starting to see the first CCTV cameras for shopping centers and other places that will include some kind of generative AI analysis. They will make mistakes. We are going to learn from them. They're going to be much superior to the existing value proposition that we have on the market. So the question for me becomes, as somebody who's interested like you on the issue of so-called soft target protection, the issue of getting to protect places that you cannot fortify. This is a longer conversation, that you have to allow them to remain open and accessible. Well, now you have a tool that you didn't have before, which is the capacity to have not only eyes, but eyes with optical nerves that go to a brain that can think automatically without the need of a human in the loop. Now, well, where the human remains and what type of response comes, well, that is probably where the business model will be for companies in this space. What cannot happen at this point is to keep ignoring the fact that one part of the puzzle, which is the analysis part, has been, well, mostly solved. Not completely solved, but 99% solved. And if we don't respond to that one, we'll be in trouble, right? Because then we will be living lives to be extinguished that could have been saved had we had in place the right kind of tools in the field.
Yeah, and it's beyond that. It's not just the analysis. The ChatGPT also gives you the so what.
Oh, yeah.
And the what to do next. And that's another thing. From these scenarios, this is the noise audit scenarios. All I did was ask GPT to assess this scenario and give it a 1 through 10. In addition to breaking that into these different criteria that it ranked and then averaged, it also gave a set of recommended actions for each one. Didn't even ask it for these, but it says, here are some immediate actions that you're going to take. You're going to notify authorities. You need to inform the school administrator. If you have a risk assessment team, notify them. Communicate with parents. This gets overlooked by actual schools every day. If you read the school shooting news like I do, every time there's a threat, every time there's an actual shooting, a gun found, somebody forgets to tell the parents. And there are parents that are outraged because they didn't know soon enough. ChatGPT in 5 seconds remembers, communicate to parents. And then it suggests some precautionary steps to take. You know, in a low threat scenario, it says, have some increased security checks. Very simple thing. So not only is this taking information, analyzing that information, doing it in a transparent, consistent, methodical manner, but it's also saying, this is what I think you should do. And this is without any prompt. Because if you fed into this ahead of time, these are all our security procedures in the school. This is our contact list. These are our prescriptive messages to parents. In 5 seconds, you can put in your threat information and it is going to pop out actionable things to do and provide to other people.
Well, I'll take one step further to that one, Dave. It actually can do it for you if you wanted to, right? So, assuming a human in the loop, right? So it could not only populate, tell you to message parents, actually make the message and upload it to whatever platform you use to communicate with them. And it could answer every single question asked based on the relevant information and data. We've been playing with the generative AI models for incident command centers, right? And a lot of the issues with incident command centers is that sometimes there's different stakeholders that need the product, the information, the common opinion in different ways because they have different needs. And so far, historically, it's been very difficult to produce every single customizable model in a and today that's a trivial effort. I was yesterday in a meeting. I shouldn't be saying this, but I was yesterday in a meeting and I received an email that said, "Hey, can we have your bio because for a future conference?" And I said, "Sure, sir." And I sent it to them, and my bio was written from a first-person point of view. So I got a reply like 2 minutes later. Again, I'm in a meeting, so I'm just using my phone right here, hiding so the person speaking doesn't see that I am not paying a lot of attention, right? And they say, "Hey, but do you have it on the third person because that's the format that we're shooting?" I say, "Sure, let me copy paste it to ChatGPT." Asked it to change it to the third person, and in literally 1 second, the product was ready to go out, right? So these are the kind of things that we don't think of it. In the past, it would have meant that I have to go and sit in front of the computer and spend the next 13 minutes or 15 minutes changing the tense of the sentences from the first to the third. And that's done, that's solved, right? So as we think about school security, right, the idea that today is impossible to have real-time analysis of images and that you have to have a pre-trained data set that you created in a proper, that's over, right? It's buried. We're done with it. So the question is, what do we do now from this platform? The good news for parents is that this actually gives us a capability we didn't have before. We've been force multiplied with not only having dumb eyes in the middle of schools, but actually eyes that can think. How do we build it for the entrepreneurs in this problem space that might feel that their products have been rendered obsolete? And I would say to your audience as they're listening, be very careful, because you're going to hear a lot of people who are going to say that, no, but our secret sauce is better. If they tell you that, ask them to demonstrate it, right? It'll be very important at this point to demonstrate that your product that costs you to develop, and I understand it, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions to develop, has now been outdated by a product that costs $20 a month. Now, there are ways to test this, right? And this should be evidence-based. And what I'm hoping is that a lot of these companies, I've seen it already in many other fields. I haven't seen it in school shootings, but I have seen it in other fields. Companies that feel that suddenly ChatGPT made their machine learning product obsolete. What they're doing very rapidly is saying, okay, what of what we were doing is still salvageable and different and unique and niche, right? And how can I now mount that on top of a generative pre-transformed model? If they're not doing that, I mean, they'll be bankrupt within a year and a half.
And Rodrigo, taking your example with the resume and just making this very real for schools, this is not, fantasy world. This is a technology that exists right this second. And what you can do in a way that you've never been able to do before is say this anonymous online threat came in. We fed it into our prompted, trained system. This is the way that it interpreted that threat. This is the way that it was scored. This is the way that we verified it. Here are all the actions it recommended taking. And then this is what we decided to do. And within seconds, that entire message, from the threat to the assessment to the analysis to the actions taken, could be sent to every single parent in your school district. So they know my kid's school is locking down right now because we got this information, and through this method, we think it's credible. And so we are disrupting your day as a parent, their day as a student, all of these things based on this. You now have something that's defensible in court, something that's following your procedures. But most of all, what parents and students say over and over after actual shootings, threats of shootings, swattings, unplanned lockdowns, they say, we just needed to know what was happening. And now you have the power to let people know exactly what a system is thinking and what actions you're taking based on it. And we can have that out to the masses in almost no time for $20 a month.
Yeah, it'll cost you a little bit more once it's a customized product, right? But still, you mentioned something before that I think is very relevant, again, in the example that you gave, is that a police officer might have the hunch that this is not a dangerous situation because he or she has the belief that manifestos are not the way these school shootings happen, and these are just things that happen at the heat of the moment, for example. And then you have something like your database, like the school shooting database, that now has captured an uncanny amount of data points related to trends. Well, one thing that ChatGPT does really well, so you said that you prompted without the school shooting database. Now imagine that you vectorized it and you say, okay, here are, I don't know how many data points you have now, Dave. How many school shootings have you captured?
Oh, more than 2,800 shootings at schools. But beyond that, I track threats, swatting, guns found, stabbings, averted shootings. All of that comes together to be thousands of different data points. We published a paper last year on an analysis of 3,000 school shooting threats.
So imagine that now every time that you're asking to assess the threat, you would do it now benchmarking. There is this thing within the model, the GPT-4 Omni, which is the code interpreter or data analysis, and say, okay, make this analysis, but make it looking at the trends that I fed you here. So not only don't use just your general knowledge or your biases, but also base it on the data available here to you. I would be very interested to see for example, once we start doing that more frequently and with more robustness, what kind of trends that humans would underappreciate or the value will come and be showcased, and then the opposite too, right? Which cases a human would give a high assessment, but the data is not there, right? So those are things that we now can use evidence to feed them all and compare its results in ways that it's much harder to do when you are dealing with the mushy brains of humans, right? So,
yeah, the very biased brains of humans. I mean, part of our noise audit in the narrative responses, there was also demographic information and then information about people's background. Have you responded to a school shooting? Has your agency been responded to a school shooting? Do you have kids that are currently in K through 12 schools? And we found that people's experiences had a strong correlation to rating
correct
the threats higher than people that didn't have those experiences. ChatGPT doesn't have any of that. It only has what you give it. So on my final question for you, Rodrigo.
Yeah.
Because we are running out of time here. But this all happened in 3 weeks. What's your prediction for how much everything changes when ChatGPT 5 comes out? And how do schools, many of whom have legacy contracts with technology that's now a couple generations behind, how do they need to be thinking about the future?
Yeah, and I'll answer with what we've been studying beyond just school shootings, but it certainly applies to this problem space too, is that I would challenge anybody to imagine yourself being at Kitty Hawk looking the Wright brother fly the first airplane, and to imagine that just 80 years later, you would be landing in Paris in the Charles de Gaulle airport in an Airbus 380 that is that double deck. It's very hard, right? It's very difficult from the beginning of a technological disruption to imagine the sense of how the system will change into the future. November 2022, when ChatGPT came to market, was our Kitty Hawk moment. It was the moment in which, for the first time, something changed. So these are the dumbest models you'll ever play with. From here, they'll just get better. These are the most erroneous and error-prone models you'll ever interact with. So I think that just in these last 2 years, we've seen a doubling on quality on the outputs of generative AI models. I am expecting that GPT-5 will come up with the incredible and radical improvements. The good news is that I don't think there'll be a disruptive technology in the sense that the disruption happened when the first one came to market. What we'll see now is a constant innovation in the quality of what they are doing. I would expect that very soon GPT models in general will be able to outperform analysis of any human being in the same context and do it in 5 seconds instead of 5 months. So my hopeful view of the future is that creative individuals will find ways to take that and mount new technologies into old problems so they can come with new solutions. For the legacy companies, for those occupying the problem space, if I were advising any of them, would say is that you are in a terrible position because you are the Kodak of the digital era, right? So you are the Blockbuster to the Netflix. There is a reason why Blockbuster didn't become the next Netflix. They could have. They have cornered their movie rental market, but they had a lot of sunk cost in their brick and mortar shops, etc. A lot of the old companies who were doing school security, especially if they had a data component for which they spend a lot of money, will be very reluctant at admitting that this model is probably better than what they have done now. If they're capable, as I said, they will be able to take the things, the secret sauce, whatever was special about them, and try to adapt it to this reality where the quality of data analysis and image analysis and response has been improved dramatically. For the school administrators, I would say be very vigilant. Look at how your provider is adapting to this new reality. And if you see no movement and no change, look at the expiration date of that contract and start looking around, because my guess is that this is going to become the Wild West. There's going to be a lot of new entrants on the market, and there'll be newer winners and losers.
Well, Rodrigo, thank you so much for coming on the Back to School Shooting podcast today. All of the articles that we talked about today are down in the show notes below, as well as Rodrigo's LinkedIn profile. Again, Dr. Rodrigo Nieto Gomez, he's a professor at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, expert in AI, futurist, startup mentor, and somebody that thinks about innovation, thinks about criminal innovation, national security. His new paper coming out, The Future of Border Security in the Age of AI. Rodrigo, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Dave. It was fun.